let me just make a little comment on Ken raised that important distinction between a landscape just seen by a viewer, whereas a landscape experienced by a walker, somebody walking through and thus engaging with the landscape. And while I think this is a very important point, has been taken up now several times, I think he just did too much honor to the Paris Situationists, because I would claim that for Romanticism, this idea, the wanderer, is such an important figure in Romanticism. So we shouldn't believe in the 19th century there was the viewer, for example, Joseph von Eichendorff, aus dem Leben eines Taugenichts, from the life of a do-no-good. It's all experience, so walking through it, the landscapes, and in many other texts. So this is actually very important in Romanticism, not in the particular poem I will engage with, and I have a handout for you. On the front page you find a poem and a little excerpt from a prose text, and on the back side you find the score, the musical score of a song which we will then hear. So my talk is titled Listening to Landscape, a Romantic Evocation of Sound and Mood. According to Carl Gustav Carus, the leading romantic theorist of an art of landscape, such art fulfills its purpose in, and now I quote Carus, representing a certain mood of the inner life, meaning by emulating a corresponding mood of the life of nature, in brackets truth, Darstellung einer gewissen Stimmung des Gemütslebens, Sinn, durch die Nachbildung einer entsprechenden Stimmung des Naturlebens, Wahrheit. So this is the key idea from which we start, an art of landscape. I must not say landscape art because that has acquired such a different meaning. In the 20th century, obviously, an art of landscape is not just about depicting nature out there, but an art of landscape, romantically understood, is really about a correspondence between the outer and the inner, between nature and us as subjects, as minds, and the correspondence between the two makes up an art of landscape, rather than showing nature or depicting or representing outward nature. So that's the idea from which we start. And note that he uses not Stimmung for the subjective state, for the state of the mind, but he uses Stimmung actually for both. Yeah? He says, representing a certain mood of the inner life by emulating a corresponding mood of the life of nature. A corresponding mood of the life of nature. Stimmung is overarching the subjective and the objective, the outer and the inner. So, on reading these words, Caspar David Friedrich's art springs to mind. You have an image here by Caspar David Friedrich. I'll come back to it at the very end of the talk. On reading these words, Caspar David Friedrich's art springs to mind. As Carus was not just a theorist, but also a painter, the link between soul and nature, he imagined, would have been accomplished through pictures. Did romantic poetry and music, or some romantic poetry and music, aim at the same feat, the feat of that correspondence? And if so, did they prove capable of it? A landscape poem by Joseph von Eichendorff, Im Walde, in the Woods, written presumably in 1835, reads, and you find that poem on the front page of my handout. Es zog eine Hochzeit den Berg entlang, ich hörte die Vögel schlagen, da blitzten viel Reiter, das Waldhorn klang, das war ein lustiges Jagen. Und eh ich's gedacht, war alles verhallt, die Nacht bedecket die Runde, nur von den Bergen noch rauschet der Wald und mich schauert im Herzensgrunde. Ignoring rhyme but approaching literal meaning, a prosaic translation could run as follows. A wedding passed along the mountain, I heard the birds singing, many riders flashed by, the horn sounded, That was a merry hunt. And before I knew it, it had all died away. Night covers the horizon. From the mountains alone, the wood still rustles, and in the depths of my heart, I shiver. Eichendorff's landscape could, it seems, hardly be more different from one of those intangible landscapes his contemporary Caspar David Friedrich painted, say, Der Mönch am Meer, The Monk by the Sea, 1809, which you see here. Friedrich deliberately avoids structuring the width of space through clearly identifiable objects. In Eichendorff's enumerative manner, by way of contrast, the landscape seems to fall neatly into little images, each compressed into a single line: the wedding party, the birds, the riders with their horns. Almost a list, as John presented in the morning. Yet this is less true of the second stanza. Mountains and night are not something in the landscape, they are the landscape surrounding us or the lyrical self. An important dimension to the experience of landscape that is more like being immersed in it than like pointing at particular items, as a sightseer would, can be sound. Sound immerses us. We immerse sound. The rustling of the woods is all around us. Sound is crucial to Eichendorff's poem, both in the way it is made and in the way it is about something. Even apart from rhyme, Im Walde constitutes a web of sound. What seems unrelated in the English prose translation is linked through sound in the German original. For instance, schauern in the final line sounds akin to rauschen in the line before. The heart's reaction thus has poetic naturalness about it. Between to rustle and to be afraid, that's all but lost. Except for cases of rare luck, there is no way to capture a poem's unique blend of sound and sense in a translation. Just as sound matters a lot to how the poem is made, it matters a lot to what it is about. Eichendorff's landscape is heard just as much as it is seen. Both senses are carefully balanced. The poem's persona presumably sees the wedding path along the mountain, line 1, hears the birds sing, line 2, sees the riders flash by, line 3, hears the horn sound, line 3, but then hears all the previous sounds die away, verhallen, line 5, sees the night cover the horizon, line 6, and finally hears the wood rustle, line 7. The course the poem takes from daylight into darkness means that the eye is ultimately rendered useless for the experience of nature, while the ear persists. The mention of individual lines left out the stanza's concluding verses, that is, lines 4 and 8. These verses do not refer to a perception, be it visual or oral, but to contrary moods, cheer, and possibly anxiety. Is this, in the words of that romantic theorist of an art of landscape, Carus, a case of, quoting again, representing a certain mood of the inner life, meaning by emulating a corresponding mood of the life of nature, truth? Yes and no. The final inner shiver, mich schauert im Herzensgrunde, is borne out in the outer sphere, the dying away of the cheerful sounds of wedding, birds and hunt, nightfall and rustling of the wood. But then it is not borne out by these outer events either. The sounds of weddings, birds and hunts disappear as a matter of course. Every day is followed by night, and woods cannot help but rustle. We all know these things, and thus the final line takes us unawares. It would be wrong to say that "Und mich schauert im Herzensgrunde" is shocking, because it is prepared to some extent. But it makes us wonder whether there was more to the events than has been said. Precisely because the mood does not, to refer to the term Carus uses, fully correspond, entsprechen, to the outward event, this is a poem that can strike us with wonder. There is an alternative version of this poem with a middle stanza, which you also find on the handout, but I'll skip this bit because we are already a little bit behind time. But we can come back to the discussion if there's interest in this alternative version, which tries to give a sort of psychological motivation to that final line of the poem. So I'll skip that one page now and move on in the direction of music. The art form aesthetically cognate to landscape appears to be painting. It even seems to be of a piece with it. Out in the open, do we not experience landscape as an image? Carus would have been assured of it. Music has never been particularly good at drawing images of anything. Robert Schumann's Opus 39, number 11, from the Liederkreis, does not convey an image of the landscape as seen at once. Rather, we listen to movement through the landscape. As the onlooker is not a hiker, here in that case, I said, often happens in Romanticism, but this onlooker is not a hiker or a wanderer. I mean, he must have got to that spot somehow, but he's not, this wandering is not the theme of the poem. As the onlooker is not a hiker, he or she is just watching. That movement can only be that of the riders. Schumann does not prepare for it. Rather, the music, ziemlich lebendig, you find the sheet music on the backside of that, and we'll listen to that piece in a second. Rather, the music, ziemlich lebendig, rather vivid, leaps into the gallop manifested within 6/8 meter as an alternation of eighth and quarter notes. From reading Eichendorff's poem, we might expect the sound of the gallop to continue only to the fourth verse. The fifth verse, after all, suggests that the action, and hence the sound, had all faded away. But the composer is not most keen on illustration. Against the surface of the text, Schumann continues, albeit after a decrescendo to pianissimo et war alles verhallt, the audible motion to the penultimate line. Discontinuing it for the final verse gets at the heart of the matter. Here is a break. The mood is not an effect caused by and thus similar to outward events, but a subjective realm of its own. While the shiver is somehow inextricable from the landscape setting, mountain, night, woods, it could not have been predicted and cannot be explained by reference to it. And we now listen to the piece in a recording, early Fischer-Dieskau recording from 1955 with Günther Weisenborn on the piano, and you can follow that in the sheet music on the back side. The pulsating rider's motive, present through 7 of the 8 lines, either as foreground or as background, receives nuanced treatment, though, setting the last verse of the first stanza, das war ein lustiges Jagen, melodic diminution by 8th livens up the motive. After the 6th verse, die Nacht bedecket die Runde, the composer, leading the middle and lower voices in thirds, uses the rhythmicized chords for a transition into the rustling woods' peculiar atmosphere. Structure is preserved, tying over and legato articulation calm down the movement. Thus Schumann creates difference in unity. The unity is that of landscape. Together with the ego of the poem, we keep in the same place, after all. But that same landscape is shown in a different light. Darkness has set in where the scene was bathed in light to start with. The flashing, blitzten of the riders had suggested not just speed, but also shine, reflection of bright sunlight on their metal gear. In terms of key, we had been in the luminous sphere of A major and D major then. Through F sharp major in the piano interlude, Schumann moves to G sharp minor for the line Die Nacht bedecket die Runde. If its dimmer light is musically manifested by means that go along with greater repose, such as legato, that again seems to set the verse that follows into relief. For the words of the final line, mich schauert's im Herzensgrunde, do not seem to stand for an attitude of composure. Those who shiver are discomposed. Or are they? Mich schauert's im Herzensgrunde can mean several things. Schauern is motion too, but not forward motion like riding. We possess a nuanced language for such motion with words like to shiver, to tremble, to shake, to quake, to quiver, or to shudder. They do not all mean the same, but neither are they defined in a way that would allow for sharp contrast. The German language distinguishes, though again not clearly, between schauern, the word used by Eichendorff, and schaudern. Schaudern features a negative accent. Ludwig Tieck calls it a vertigo of the soul, einen Schwindel der Seele. Schaudern can mean to be horrified, used with a prepositional phrase, vor etwas schaudern, often comes close to shrink back from something. Schauern, without the D, schauern is more open for negative as well as positive sense. While Schauergeschichten are horror stories, there are also Schauer der Ehrfurcht, shivers of reverence or awe. This suggests, however, that the negative meaning prevails if nothing is added. Both in Eichendorff's time and now, imagining the lyrical self in a mode of anxiety would be the most likely take on the poem. Though likely, finding anxiety in the shower is not the sole sensible interpretation. Schauer der Ehrfurcht, shivers of reverence, may be anything but far-fetched for a romantic mind spellbound by nature. As Rauschen in the penultimate line is a mirror word to schauern, using the same consonants and vowels, the latter may then be empathy. Schumann seems to come close to such a reading. True, the last verse is set apart. For the first time in the song, the composer discontinues rather than just modifies the rhythmical pattern, opting now for longer notes. The musical conclusion makes sense, but it was far from predictable. Like the romantic project elsewhere, this particular musical design too is quite remote from Enlightenment psychology of the de Holbach type, where inner states are effects caused by external circumstances. The subjective sphere, as imagined by a romantic artist, is a world of its own. In a non-mechanical way, though, landscape can touch a self and seems to do so here in Schumann's rendering, as testified by the vocal line on Mich schauert's ascending by a 6 and the expressive chromatic descending line on Herzensgrunde placed in the bright sphere of A major, the home key. Schumann's music of anxiety sounds very different, as listeners would know from the immediately preceding song from Opus 39, Zwielicht, Twilight. That's really anxiety music. Although a turn to empathy with nature may be less stark than a turn to anxiety would have been, it can and should amaze as much. Schumann was aware that we would need a moment to fully realize it, and hence, you will have heard that, he repeated the final line with that marvelous leap down by an octave towards the tonic at the end. This looks like a satisfactory conclusion, but it might be self-satisfied rather than satisfactory. Any of the musical elements mentioned, a line ascending by a 6, a chromatic descending line, a key of A major, a leap down by an octave towards the tonic, is no more straightforward than a word such as schauern. Perhaps they are not meant to be. Relating Mich schauert's im Herzensgrunde to anxiety instead of empathy could hardly be wrong. That reflection about romantic art we owe to the romantic artists themselves. Caspar David Friedrich's open skies are screens, and his fellow romantic, the poet Clemens Brentano, realized, and this is the quotation you find on the bottom of the front page, the last quotation, and it refers to precisely that picture, the painting that you find here, Der Mönch am Meer, the monk by the sea. So he, Clemens Brentano, a writer, is talking about this painting. Das, was ich in dem Bilde selber finden sollte, fand ich erst zwischen mir und dem Bild, nämlich einen Anspruch, den mein Herz an mein Bild machte, und einen Abbruch, den mir das Bild tat, und so ward ich selbst der Kapuziner. So this figure, that tiny figure that you see there on the painting, das Bild ward die Düne, das aber, wo hinaus ich mit Sehnsucht blicken sollte, die See fehlte ganz. So in English, what I should have found in the painting itself, that I found only between myself and the painting, that is a claim made by heart upon the painting and a refusal perpetrated by the painting upon me, and thus I myself became that Capuchin monk. The painting became the dune, yet wherefore I should look out with longing, the sea was altogether missing. What each of us hopes to find in Eichendorff's poem or in Schumann's song, that we only find between each of us and the poem or song. We must, as it were, enter these works of art, hoping to render them complete in this way. But once we have entered, we realize that we too cannot provide the finishing touch. Such is the nature of romantic landscape and, entwined with it, of romantic mood. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, and thank you to Judith as well. I have a thought which I've been trying to articulate to myself about, again, about Ken's remark about walking, and relating to what Judith said, that she described a civilization in which landscape has a religious meaning, clearly, and is an object of pilgrimage. it isn't just that the Situationists were wrongly praised by Ken, or that the Romantics were ignored with their wanderer idea, but the pilgrim concept really needed to be brought in earlier. The interesting thing about the Sinai landscape that Judith illustrated was that it's harsh. And it becomes interesting because it's harsh. You have to climb up. You become nearer to God because you're casting away all your earthly comforts as you get to the top, as Moses did. Moses earned the law by climbing that mountainside. And this pilgrimage idea that the landscape is there to be overcome in order to be nearer to God is changed by the Caspar David Friedrich into something quite different, is it? That God has come down into the landscape in some way, and we wander around it, and we find him. He is that thing rustling in the forest, and that shiver in the heart is our proximity to him, which of course is a different kind of proximity from Moses on the burning bush. There's a kind of aestheticization of it. Anyway, these are comments, not questions. But
yeah. Well, this is a wonderful suggestion. I'm very sorry that Germany does not have to offer any major deserts, so to have to offer these hardships. So in the Romantic poetry, you always get normally a lot of mountains, but not extremely high mountains, with a lot of trees on them and so on. So you don't get that hardship. But I think this is as close as it gets actually to a desert, because the sea is, of course, a desert. And it's fascinating to see that up to the 18th century, where there's a spirit of rationality and enlightenment, the painters tried, and also in the Baroque, of course, they tried to fill the pictures with many images. And then this is one of the first where this horror vacui is overcome, and paintings. Turner is, of course, the master of it, and London, several museums in London have the splendid collection of Turners, who goes even further than Caspar David Friedrich. But of course, the sea is the sort of desert that Europe has to offer, as it has no major deserts. And then we are exposed to the subject is exposed to this nature, and of course this has a lot to do with the idea of the sublime, das Erhabene, which goes back to the Pseudo-Longinus and is connected to the idea of the sacred later on. Of course, Longinus does not have anything to do with Christianity and so on. But this is, I think this is a very fascinating idea that you suggest.
Thank you for this excellent talk. I wanted to invite you to say more about the middle stanza and what the history of it is, at what point it was added, and what you think the significance is. Yeah.
This middle stanza, we don't actually know exactly by whom it is. Schumann made two compositions of this poem. One is this piano and song, and the other is in Opus 75, so somewhat later, and is for choir a cappella. And there he introduces this middle stanza, which you have it on the handout front page. I'll just read these 4 verses for you. Der Bräutigam küsst die blasse Braut, die Mutter spricht leis nicht klagen, fortschmettert das Horn durch die Schluchten laut, es war ein lustiges Jagen. The bridegroom kisses the pale bride, the mother says quietly, do not wail. The horn goes on to blare loudly through the canyons. That was a cheerful hunt. And we know that it's in the composition by Schumann. It might be by they sound like Eichendorff. They could be by Eichendorff, and they actually, as you see, they take up a line. In the Eichendorff it says, das war ein lustiges Jagen, and here es war ein lustiges Jagen. So he takes up something from the Eichendorff and so on. It's probably not by Eichendorff. It's not impossible, but improbable. It may be by Clara Schumann or some friend of Schumann or by Schumann. But it's interesting what this middle section does to the poem, because it tries to psychologically motivate that state in dieses "Und mich schauert im Herzensgrunde," and in the depths of my heart I shiver. It tries to psychologically motivate that, and then we would understand why this is anxiety, because this wedding is actually terrible for the bride and they will have a life of unhappiness, and so we understand why the onlooker shivers. But as you will probably have noticed, it doesn't work. This middle line doesn't work, because landscape is created, we've touched this point several times actually this morning, landscape is created by distance. And here, he can hear what somebody is saying in die Mutter spricht leis. He's supposed to hear that, what's going on, say, 600 meters or a kilometer away and so on. So it doesn't work because it ignores that landscape is actually created by distance in order to bring in a psychology of intimacy, of personal, close personal connection. I don't experience a landscape if I stand in front of a tree. You know, then I can hear what's going on next to me if there's somebody talking and so on, but that's not landscape. So this is a failure, this middle section, but it's understandable, and it has to do with obviously feeling uneasy with this irrationality of romantic landscape, that you experience moods that you can't explain causally as an Enlightenment psychologist would have it.
Thank you, Andreas. That was really interesting. I really like the Brentano quote, and I was wondering whether you could say something a bit about this idea that Brentano says that there's something he should have found in the painting, as where before he enters it, and how much that's a challenge to, as it were, enter landscapes, to fully immerse, and to, as it were, as you described it, reach a sort of Stimmung where the subject and the object sort of come together. The sense that we feel like before we enter a landscape or this painting in this sense, there's something that we should feel.
Yeah, the Brentano quote is a bit above me. I think I understand some of it. I think there is something going on which escapes me, which I think Brentano is a wonderful writer. So I think there is something, but there is something in it which I do not fully understand. The point I was stressing is the one that. It's not, so to speak, objectively in the work of art and then can be proven by some scientific procedure. That's the meaning. But that the meaning is a process and interaction between the work of art and the viewer. This does not mean it's subjective, as is often everything goes and just what you feel. But the stress is more both spheres are. So on the one hand side, it rules off a sort of scientific explanation of art, like what is often now tried through neuroscience and so on. And on the other hand, it rules out complete subjectivism. There is something in the painting. It's not just a screen. It is a screen onto which we project, but not just a screen. It also is a screen with something on it. It offers us. This is the thing I understand. And I think the second thing I understand is that this is connected with an inside-outside perspective, which Roger uses in much of his writing, external and internal standpoint, that you have to get into certain things in order to understand them. And this is when it says, I myself became the Capuchin monk. You have to speak to get into the picture, and so the same you would have to do with the Eichendorff poem. You would have to become this viewer who sees the wedding pass and so on. You know, if you just observe it from the outside. I don't understand other elements of the quote, like I don't quite understand the painting became the dune. This is almost transforming art into nature, because the dune is a natural object. So that's a tricky notion, that art becomes nature itself. And the other thing which is very hard to comprehend is that the sea was altogether missing, given that the sea is so crucial to this picture. The sea is eliminated. This was also the point which Roger talked about, and I mentioned Turner, that the sea becomes such an important element for this struggle we have, and this difficulty, and the necessity to overcome things. But if that's eliminated, perhaps he feels uneasy with this, that the sea is sort of a stand-in for the religious, and Brentano was more of a skeptic than, for example, Eichendorff was not a skeptic. He was a devout Catholic and Christian, but Brentano was more of a skeptic. So that may be, but this is a very tentative interpretation. That's, I think, all I can say about it. It's also from a slightly longer text, 2-3 pages or so, so one would have to contextualize it. I'm sorry, I know this is insufficient what I'm saying, but an approach.
Andreas, you were mentioning the text, and I think it is so constructed, the text by Eichendorff.
Yeah.
We have line 5, there's the everything or all, and it ends, the whole text ends with the me, so somehow I think the all and the me is somehow connected, as it is also when we have poems by Novalis and so on. So the I or the me spots the everything and then always shivers. And we have line 7, where we have the mountains, and then let's say the last line, the depth of the heart is like the deep sea or the deep lake, in contrast or in contrary to the mountains. I see it like that. So somehow with this last line, I wonder, what do you think of the interpretation in the music? Why does Schumann repeat it, and don't you think it is somehow misinterpreting Eichendorff?
Well, it's always a change, of course, to a poem. In a sense, it's not the same poem anymore if you repeat a line, because the identity of a poem is in exactly these words. The lead is not, so to speak, the poem in music or so, but it's in a sense a different text. I think that's always true, that there is a change. I think the reason why he repeats is because this riding motion, also there are musical variants to it, but it goes on for 7 lines, and he was aware that would be a too passing moment just to have that other state, this state of calmness, just for that brief moment. For some balance in the poem, he needed to repeat it, and I think it works musically. It has to be like that. I don't deny that it does a little bit of violence to the poem. It certainly does. All great lead composers do that. Only the mediocre ones, which Goethe liked, like Zelter or so, they actually reproduced only the poems in music. But the great ones, they change the poems, not always by repeating lines, but already the music changes it. Often verse is actually transferred into prose by it, because the music goes, the singing often goes over the first lines, and all these things happened. The other thing you mentioned, und ich's gedacht, war alles verhallt, first line of the second stanza. I would have to think about it. It's a fascinating idea. If you read it on the surface, of course, this alles refers just to the individual sound items, so to speak, of the first stanza. So you heard the birds, you heard the horn, and all this has vanished. But it's written with a capital A, and there is, of course, this notion of all. In German, you wouldn't use it grammatically exactly. You would then say, war das Allverhalt, which would be, of course, impossible. But there may be an allusion to it that actually, so to speak, the outward cosmic order vanishes for one who is retreating in that second stanza to himself, like in this extreme artwork of the night, Tristan and Isolde, heavily influenced by German Romanticism, especially by Novalis, Hymnen an die Nacht, and so on, where the whole world, so to speak, disappears, the whole outward world disappears to retreat. I think it would be an over-interpretation of that, but there may be something to it. It's a fascinating idea. Certainly the idea was in the air from around 1800, and this is much later than 1800.
I would like to thank you very much for this extraordinary integration of the musical and the poetic. I know it is something very common in the Romantic era, and but it's not often so well illustrated. And what I find so interesting is that it is really beyond the notion of patron, of court, of anything to do with these distinguished elite figures who had commandeered both painting and music by being the people who paid for it. And this is such an interesting development of a completely different, free association, but it is very, very finely brought together in these two elements that you made integral. Thank you so much. It really enlightened me about this notion of the Romantic tradition.
Thank you very much.
I was going to make exactly the same point. It was a Gesamtkunstwerk, in a way, what you offered us. You're bringing all those things together. I just thought it's fantastic. One final point on the missing stanza. There is a particularly somber poem, a song of Hugo Wolf, one of his Mörkerlieder, which is about a wedding. And again, you had the sense, you had the sense of the bride as a sacrificial victim. And it was clearly appropriate that he should have left that middle stanza out, because it is completely at right angles, it seems to me, to the whole tenor of the poem he actually set to music.
Yeah, in this poem to which you allude, der Himmel hängt voller Geigen, but it's a lot of irony, scathing irony in this, and also the way Hugo Wolf treats it. And this is, I mean, already these two stanzas which we talked about really exclude such a bringing in irony or so. This would really be a combination of elements, whereas in the Wolf poem it works wonderfully because it's scathing from the first line to the last.
Can I just draw the association with what John said?
Yes.
About preferring Goethe to Newton. Mm-hmm. And I just want to make a comment that with the Byzantine landscape that Roger talked about, these churches, the gold in them was the gold of heaven. So they were, mm-hmm. though they might have loved the terrible sparseness of nature at the top of the mountain, mm-hmm. their aim was heaven. And the gold and the color in it was the color of heaven. Mm. So, and here I think is the darkness you're talking about, is the darkness of realizing that God had not created the world as it appeared, which is what the Enlightenment, which is of course a process of a darkening of the visible world, was, and all these stories and this tale of this wanderer searching for God who has ceased to exist in the visible world, which is one reason why music becomes so amazingly dominant and the visual world begins to disappear. Yeah. Turner painted The Last Sunset, and Goethe complained that Newton had destroyed the meaning of the rainbow. by working out the spectrum. So he tried to prove Newton wrong, and partly succeeded.
Yeah. Thank you. I mean, Angelika reminded us earlier that we shouldn't think the landscape is just down there. The skies are, of course, part of the landscape, and Scotland has different skies from Venice and so on. And that's, of course, part of the landscape. And I said earlier in this exchange with Roger that Europe doesn't have deserts, but the sea can be like a desert. Also, skies can be like deserts. They can be vast and threatening and such things, and that should be included. And then we can look at such a sky here on the Friedrich building, which where the sky is part of the landscape, and that's apart from what has been said about the sea, is a very important additional observation.
I just throw in one thought about the going back to the wandering. But by the way, Scotland doesn't have a sky; we only have clouds. If you read, I'm sure most people know the great essay by Thoreau on walking.
Yes.
And he begins it with this charming discussion of the word saunter in English, which he probably quite wrongly says has two possible routes. One is sans terre, without earth, without land, and the other one is sainte terre, holy ground. And it seems to me that what Thoreau's pointing to is something that happens in the 20th century, eventually, in reaction, and part of transcendentalism is a reaction against the lack of foreground here. What I think is happening, and often happens in Friedrich paintings, is there is no foreground for the viewer to stand on, as it were, to look at the painting. We are forced into the position of the monk or the solitary figure in the landscape, whoever it might be. The wanderer, for me, goes back not so much to the pilgrim, because I prefer to emphasize another side of things, the wanderer going back to the old Celtic and Anglo-Saxon idea of the liegeless person, the person who has no allegiance, doesn't belong, is therefore in danger constantly because they have no protection, but they are without earth, and by becoming wanderers in that way, they find all of the earth holy, so they sacralize the earth as they walk it. And I think that's what Thoreau was saying. That's another possible way of looking at it. Yeah. I actually think what you've said today is wonderfully illustrative, actually, of one of the great failures of Romanticism, which is that the artist so often impresses their ego upon us as we experience the work. And I find that transcendentalism works towards bringing us out of that and into modernism. But that's my own view.
Thank you. Yeah, in literary theory, there's much talk of the implicit reader. So, what sort of reader is implied by a text? But there's, of course, also something like an implicit viewer in a painting, and I think you spelled that out beautifully in the way that we are, so to speak, almost pressed into the position of the Capuchin monk because there's so little to stand on there. And the other thing, I think, why much of this romantic art still intrigues us and fascinates is that it has such an ambiguous stance towards the holy, the saint, the sanctus, and Roger, of course, has written a lot about it, especially with regard to Wagner, to The Ring, and to Tristan. That this is not anymore the holy or of the traditional religion, but it's nevertheless sort of retrieving it. But of course, you can look at much of these artworks again in another way, as Julian Spalding was doing, when you just focus on the bleakness of this, and that almost they seem to get rid of God and get rid of the sacred. So many of these artworks engage with the sacred and also seem to push it out. Sometimes the same artworks at the same time, some more and some less. But this is fascinating, and I think is a reason why that art still fascinates us.